Recently, the third Blackthornprod Game Jam took place, an event where participants had 1 week to design and develop a video game based on a particular theme, hosted by indie game developer and YouTuber Blackthornprod. I'd heard good things about the previous editions of this game jam, so I decided to participate. On Saturday, January 23rd, the theme of the jam was revealed: Less is More. A very broad and fun concept with a lot of space for interpretation and cool ideas. I wasn't able to start working on a game until Monday. However, I did come up with an idea on Sunday. The first thing that came into my mind was a game in which the player's character had to become less powerful in order to complete a set of challenges. Somehow this would be driven by the level design. This was a very abstract concept and I wasn't sure how to apply it at first, so I put it aside for a while. I also liked the idea of introducing the jam's theme into the story as well. I thought of working on a deep experience about a character that leaves material possessions behind and discovers beauty in other aspects of life. None of these ideas were directly used in the final game, but they served to trigger brainstorming and I repurposed them into the idea I ended up working on, a game about a character that becomes weaker over time, for some reason driven by the story. I figured it would be great if the difficulty of the game increased because of this core mechanic, so I thought of making the player complete the same level over and over again, but each time controlling a less powerful character, so the player would have to become more skilled in the game to compensate. With all of this in mind, I decided to bring this idea to life in a classic bullet hell type of game, where the character would have 3 main attributes: health points, movement speed, and weapon damage, which would decrease over time. There are many attributes to play with in bullet hell games, but I decided to keep it simple for the context of a jam. However, I knew I had to have at least 3 to make the player's choices interesting, as my plan was to make the player choose which ability to decrease after each level. I accompanied this concept with a sci-fi story. The character becomes weaker because it is forced to leave its high-tech equipment behind one piece at a time, as part of a training to fight in a war against a robot army that learned how to hack into the humans' weapons to use them to their advantage. With this idea on my mind, I started developing the first features on Monday evening, but before that, I spent some time looking for a pre-made asset for the game's graphics, as I was participating in the jam alone and I'm not good at art, especially with so little time. I ended up going for a retro arcade style using a very nice tileset made by Kenny, which is designed for platformer games, but I noticed it could also work for my top-down bullet hell idea. Now that I had made the decision on the visuals, I started development by building a simple 2D environment where the action would take place, and then added the main character and the basic movement controls. After this, I started working on an enemy. My plan for the day was to have a very basic prototype to understand if the game could be fun. I worked on an enemy even before having a shooting mechanic, because I thought it could help me understand things such as how the space was going to be used and if the graphics were a good choice. The first enemy wanders around in a pseudo-random manner. It basically picks a random direction to move every few seconds, but following a certain behavior that restricts the spectrum of possible directions to make it look a little bit smarter. This movement behavior is not perfect at this point, but it gets better later on after balancing some parameters. Now that I had a dummy enemy, I worked on one of the key mechanics of bullet hell games: bullets, or projectiles. I made the character shoot bursts following the mouse direction and the enemy fire projectiles creating a spiral pattern. I also added the concept of health points for both the player and the enemy. At first I set the player's health to 3 points, so it goes down after 3 shots, and I made the enemies have many more hit points than the player. At this point I had a very basic bullet hell game working, so it was time to develop my twist to incorporate the jam's theme. The 3 attributes I had in mind were already in place: HP, movement speed, and damage. So I only had to add a new screen where the player could select an attribute to decrease and thus make the next run harder. This screen is shown when all enemies are defeated. Now the players have to make a tough choice every time they beat a level. They can lose health points and resist fewer hits, slow down movement speed, which makes it harder to avoid enemy projectiles, or inflict less damage and thus take longer to destroy the enemies. Each attribute has 3 predefined values. All start at the highest one and can be reduced 2 times. So the first level starts with health, speed, and damage, each with a value of 3, and the last one would be when all of those have a value of 1. I also closed the game loop, resetting the stats and starting over when the player's character is defeated. And with that I finished my first day with a very promising complete prototype, which I was very happy about. On Tuesday I worked on basic visual needs and extended what I did on Monday, for example by adding new enemy types. I made use of the sprite animations that came with Kenny's assets for the player and the enemy, and also added a simple UI to show the current value of each attribute. I decided to improve the terrain design with some obstacles, to act as barriers for the bullets, so that the player has the possibility to hide behind the wall to defend from enemy fire. I also implemented a countdown before each level, as the player had no time to prepare for the battle, and I spent the rest of the night creating 2 more enemy types, one that is fast and shoots a burst of projectiles directly to the player, and a very slow one that fires an explosion of bullets every now and then. This made the game much more fun. It added variety and more interesting decisions for the player to make, such as which enemy to attack first. Wednesday was all about the story. I wrote a script with some lines to introduce the game to the players, to make them understand the goal and the key decisions they would have to make on each level. All of this I framed within a story where the different stats are actually pieces of equipment that the character is forced to leave behind in a fight. I decided to tell the story with voice lines. I didn't like the idea of using text for this. I wanted to build a character to get the player's attention. So I acted out the lines myself and spent some time improving the quality and character of the recordings. I introduced these voice lines with different triggers inside the game, which ended up working pretty nicely and people seemed to enjoy it. I then added some sound effects. This was particularly hard because, in my opinion, bullet hell games need great sound effects to make the projectiles feel powerful, but at the same time, these effects don't have to be too exhausting, as there are going to be a ton of them. I'm no expert here, and I also didn't have that much time, so I tried to keep it simple. Finally, on Wednesday I created a few additional screens. First, an intro scene, where the story is introduced and the controls are presented to the player, which I think is useful in the context of a game jam. Then, a scene for the credits with a simple celebration animation, and lastly, I made visual improvements to the scene where the player selects the attribute to be reduced. On Thursday I made the game look pretty. I added a big flash effect to make it highly visible when the character gets hit and some particle effects to make the player's projectiles look more powerful. For this last part I used white squares as the particle's shape. I was really surprised about how that turned out. This simple shape fitted perfectly with the rest of the visuals I chose for this game. Then I added some post-processing to the camera in order to make it look like an old screen. For this I used the vignettes, some grain, and a bit of chromatic aberration. To finish off, I chose a crosshair to replace the mouse pointer and developed a simple fade-in transition effect to use between screen changes. And with that, I had a complete game and I was ready for submission day. I spent the last few hours before the deadline playtesting, fixing minor bugs here and there and balancing the game. I tried to keep the game balanced throughout the entire process, but the heavy work was done on the final day, where I realized the game was simply too hard. I made some last-minute adjustments. I added an extra hit point to the player, the maximum value became 4 and the minimum 2, and I also made the final movement speed way faster and the enemy projectiles slower, along with a lot of smaller balance improvements. Finally, I created builds for PC and for web browsers, took a few screenshots of the game, put together a quick thumbnail, and made my submission to the jam a couple of hours before the deadline. The game ended up being much more fun than I expected it to be. I wasn't sure if I would be able to make something good in such a short period of time, so I'm really excited with the results. I believe the most challenging part of the project was to keep the game balanced. There were too many variables: the enemy's intelligence, the amount of bullets, their speed, fire rates, damage, health points, and so on, and even some of these had several different values because the player could change them. So it was crucial to play test it often, which is something I probably failed at, and thus had to do a lot of last-minute fixes. Even with all the work that I put into balancing the game, most of the comments that I received about it mentioned that it is just too hard for a jam. And also very unforgiving, as the player has to start the game all over again each time the character is defeated. I totally agree with the feedback. I did it this way because I wanted the players to try different approaches on which pieces of equipment to drop first, but I should have found a different solution. Something that was mentioned in several comments that would help with the difficulty issue is to add invincibility frames after the character gets hit. This is a great idea, as it would make the more frustrating deaths less frequent, which in my opinion are when the player gets shot from many different angles and loses all the health points at once, just because of one mistake. It would be cool to develop some additional features like that one. I also considered including a dash mechanic and many secondary improvements, such as subtitles for the voice lines, better visual effects, and music, which I didn't end up putting into the game. On the positive side, people that gave me feedback mentioned that they enjoyed the voice lines and the story and how I interpreted the theme. They also said that the game is bug-free, feels responsive, and that it is fun overall, which is simply great to hear. Having access to all of this great feedback is one of the many perks of participating in a game jam. It is also a great way to learn how to deal with many of the most common issues game developers face, such as scope creep, time management chaos, and loss of motivation. I highly encourage you to try it if you haven't already. Also, at the end you probably will want to give something back to the community by writing feedback to other developers, and that is a great excuse to spend the entire weekend playing video games, which I totally did for this jam. If you want to play the game, you can do so by following the link in the description. You can let me know what you think about the game, or share your experience with the game jam in the comment section. Please consider subscribing for more videos like this, and see you next time.